December 3rd, 1976, Hope Road, Kingston, Jamaica. Bob Marley was rehearsing for a free peace concert when gunmen stormed his home, firing bullets that would forever change the trajectory of his life and music. The attack that was meant to silence the voice of Rastafari instead sent Bob Marley into exile in London, where he would create Exodus, the album that would carry reggae music to every corner of the world. This is the story of how violence drove a prophet from his homeland, and how that exile transformed both the man and his music into something that transcended borders, cultures, and generations. But to understand the significance of Bob's exile, you have to understand the political powder keg that Jamaica had become in the mid-1970s. The island nation was torn apart by violence between supporters of the Jamaica Labour Party and the People's National Party, with both sides using music and musicians as weapons in their ideological war. Bob Marley, with his massive influence over Jamaica's youth and his messages of unity and social consciousness, had become a target for those who saw his music as a threat to their political ambitions. The assassination attempt on Hope Road wasn't random violence. It was a calculated attack designed to prevent Bob from performing at the Smile Jamaica concert, a free event organized to promote peace during a particularly violent election season. 7 gunmen invaded the compound where Bob lived and rehearsed, firing over 80 rounds and wounding Bob, his wife Rita, and his manager Don Taylor. The fact that Bob survived at all was seen by many, including Bob himself, as divine intervention, proof that Jah had more work for him to do in this world. The decision to leave Jamaica wasn't easy for Bob Marley. This was a man whose entire spiritual and artistic identity was rooted in the island soil, whose Rastafarian faith taught him that Ethiopia was Zion, but Jamaica was home. Leaving felt like abandonment, both of his people and his principles, but staying would have meant certain death. The same forces that had tried to kill him were still active, still powerful, still determined to silence the voice that spoke for Jamaica's oppressed masses. London, in 1977, offered Bob both sanctuary and opportunity, but it also represented everything foreign to his Rastafarian worldview. The cold, gray city was the heart of the Babylonian system that his faith taught him to reject, the center of the colonial empire that had enslaved his ancestors and exploited his homeland. Yet it was in this unlikely setting that Bob would create music that honored his Jamaican roots while speaking to universal human experiences of struggle, faith, and liberation. The recording sessions for Exodus took place at Island Studios in West London, in a creative environment that was both familiar and strange. Chris Blackwell, the founder of Island Records, who had been championing reggae music for years, provided Bob with the resources and creative freedom he needed to make the album he wanted to make. But the physical distance from Jamaica created an emotional and spiritual challenge that influenced every song on the album. Working with the Wailers in London allowed Bob to explore musical ideas that might have been impossible in the charged political atmosphere of Kingston. Songs like Jamming and One Love/People Get Ready carried messages of unity and celebration that felt both nostalgic and hopeful. Celebrations of Jamaican culture delivered from the perspective of exile. The music was infused with longing for home, but also with determination to carry that home spirit to the wider world. The title track, Exodus, became both a personal statement about Bob's own journey and a universal anthem about liberation and movement. The song's biblical references to the Israelites' escape from Egypt resonated with Bob's own experience of fleeing violence and oppression, but they also spoke to anyone who had ever felt trapped and dreamed of freedom. The track's hypnotic rhythm and uplifting message made it accessible to audiences who had never heard reggae music before. 3 little birds emerged from Bob's observations of life in exile, his ability to find peace and optimism even in unfamiliar surroundings. The song's simple message that every little thing gonna be all right became one of reggae music's most beloved and universal statements. Proof that profound truth could be expressed in the simplest terms. The track demonstrated Bob's genius for creating music that was both deeply personal and broadly appealing. Recording in London also allowed Bob to experiment with production techniques and musical arrangements that enhanced reggae's international appeal without compromising its essential character. The album's sound was cleaner and more polished than his earlier recordings, making it more accessible to radio programmers and international audiences while maintaining the spiritual and cultural authenticity that made reggae music powerful. The release of Exodus in June 1977 marked a turning point not just for Bob Marley but for reggae music as a cultural force. The album reached audiences in Europe, North America, and Africa who had never experienced this music before, introducing them to a sound and message that would influence musicians and activists for generations. The success proved that music rooted in specific cultural traditions could achieve global relevance when it addressed universal human concerns. The tour that followed the album's release saw Bob performing in venues, and for audiences unlike any he had encountered before. European concert halls, American theaters, African stadiums. Each setting required him to adapt his performance style while maintaining the spiritual intensity that made his music transformative. The exile that had begun as escape became evangelism, a mission to carry reggae's message of liberation and consciousness to every corner of the world. But the success of Exodus also intensified Bob's homesickness and his sense of responsibility to Jamaica. The album's international acclaim proved that reggae music could be a powerful tool for social change on a global scale, but it also reminded Bob daily of the homeland he had been forced to leave behind. The exile that had created this masterpiece also created a spiritual wound that would never fully heal. The impact of Exodus extended far beyond music, influencing political movements, spiritual practices, and cultural expressions around the world. The album introduced millions of people to Rastafarian philosophy, to awareness of African history and identity, to possibilities for resistance and liberation that they had never considered before. Bob's exile had transformed him from a Jamaican musician into a global prophet. By the time Bob returned to Jamaica in 1978 for the One Love Peace concert, Exodus had established him as an international icon whose influence transcended music. The album created during his darkest period of exile had become a beacon of hope and resistance for oppressed people everywhere. Proof that art created from personal suffering could become a source of universal healing and inspiration. Looking back, Exodus stands as Bob Marley's masterpiece, the album where his artistic vision, spiritual message, and musical innovation achieved perfect synthesis. The exile that had been forced upon him by violence and political hatred had become the catalyst for creating music that would inspire millions of people to seek love, unity, and liberation in their own lives. The creative process during Bob's London exile was deeply influenced by his spiritual practices and his connection to Rastafarian philosophy. Each morning, Bob would rise before dawn to meditate and give thanks to Yah, seeking guidance for the music he was creating. The cold London mornings felt alien compared to the warm Jamaican sunshine he missed. But this contrast between his physical environment and spiritual home became part of the album's emotional landscape. The Wailers who accompanied Bob into exile shared his sense of displacement and longing for Jamaica. Bassist Aston Family Man Barrett and drummer Carlton Barrett provided the rhythmic foundation that anchored Bob's melodies, while their own homesickness infused the music with layers of melancholy and determination. The band's chemistry in exile was different from their Kingston sessions, more intense and focused. The influence of Exodus on subsequent reggae artists was immediate and lasting. Musicians across Jamaica and throughout the Caribbean recognized that Bob had created a template for how reggae music could maintain its cultural authenticity while reaching global audiences. The album's success opened doors for countless other reggae artists, proving that music rooted in African Caribbean traditions could achieve international commercial success without compromising its spiritual message. The young man who fled Jamaica in fear for his life had transformed his exile into an exodus that carried reggae music and Rastafarian consciousness to the farthest reaches of the globe, proving that sometimes the greatest gifts emerge from the deepest personal trials.